Chapter 5: The Colonial Society on the Eve of the Revolution. So there's population growth going on in the colonies. In the 1700s, there's about 300,000 people, but in the next 75 years, there's about 2.5 million people inhabiting the 13 colonies. And in the 1700s, there was about 400,000 white immigrants and about 200,000 black slaves. And from that time period on, the American population doubled every 25 years. In the 1700s, as you can see from the increased number of white immigrants and the forced slaves coming in from Africa. And this number and this amount of increased immigration had political consequences as well. And as you can see, the ratio of colonists per English subject changed from 1 to 20 to 1 to 3. So the colonists are having more of a say, as you can see, theoretically within the British government, even though they have no representation in Parliament, as you know, a major concept that we'll explore later. And the bulk of the population was in Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Maryland, which makes sense because these are both port cities. These all have port cities, and these are all areas of big commerce and business in the colonies. So the Germans exemplify how colonial America was a melting point at this time period. They made about 6% of the population, about 1.5 million people by 1775, and they fled Germany in the early 1700s, the German states, because of religious persecution, war, and economic oppression. Because the German states were mostly Catholic. They belonged to mostly Protestant sects, mostly Lutheran, so they left because of religious freedom. They told about 1/3 of the Pennsylvanian population because they wanted more economic freedom and land, which the Quaker colony provided. And because they were German and weren't British, they had no deep-rooted loyalty to the crown, so they hung tightly to the German language and customs because they felt that the crown didn't have any control over them. So the Scots-Irish, what a group. In 1775, they totaled about 175,000 people, about 7% of the colonial population, and they were lowlanders who had been transported to Northern Ireland, where they prospered and they were resented by the Irish Catholics. And because of their economic troubles worsened because of the English government had control of Scotland and Ireland at the time period, and they placed restrictions on linens and woolens, their main industries, which really inhibited and restricted their ability to grow economically. And as a result, the Scots-Irish just left Ireland and they came to America for the tolerance and the farming opportunities. And just like the Germans, they settled in Pennsylvania, and they were great frontiersmen. But they also had a chain of settlements along the Great Wagon Road, which is about the western edge of Pennsylvania all the way down to Georgia. So there were a lot of problems with the Scots-Irish. They were pugnacious, lawless, individualistic, and they even broke the law by distilling whiskey along the Appalachian Mountains. Because they had no respect for the British government, again, like the Germans didn't have any respect either, they led the march of the Paxton Boys against the Quaker oligarchy, because they thought they were too lenient towards the Indians. And one of the people who led the Paxton Boys was none other than Andrew Jackson. And they also led the Regulator movement in North Carolina, another insurrection against the Eastern domination of colonial affairs, because the Scots-Irish thought that they weren't getting a fair share, just like they thought they were being oppressed back in Ireland. And just like we mentioned before, one of these people was Andrew Jackson. So the other 5% of the colonies included French Huguenots, Welsh, Dutch, Swedes, Jews, Irish, Swiss, Scots, and Scots Highlanders. But the largest non-English group was African, slaves mostly, which made about 20% of the population in 1775. So just more about the population. The population of the 13 colonies was mainly Anglo-Saxon and British, but it was still the most mixed place out of anywhere in the world. The South held 90% of the colony's slaves and had the largest diversity, and New England was made mostly of Puritans and had the least diversity because they were mostly the religious, these strong religious Protestant beliefs. The middle colonies like Pennsylvania, they had white immigrants and different immigrants from different European countries as well, so they also were a melting pot with different ethnic groups. But outside of New England, which was very much Anglo-Saxon, 1/2 of the population was non-English, which shows the extreme diversity of the colonies at this time period. So America was very multicultural at this time, and even a French settler named I can't say that, but he called America a strange mixture of blood, which you will find in no other colony, and said, "What then is the American, this new man?" Which shows that America was the most diverse place on earth, and Europeans and other people from all over the world didn't expect anything like this to happen in a British colony. And yes, we have to acknowledge that the African slave trade along the colonies increased European immigration and helped make America the most diverse place on earth. But it was also the land, the opportunities, and the religious tolerance that America offered that also made America very attractive. So slavery in the Chesapeake colonies. It was less physically enduring than the deeper South because tobacco was just an easier crop to tend to other than cotton and all these physical crops where you had to have full physical exertion and it was very tolling on your body. The size and the proximity of the tobacco farms allowed slaves more frequent contact with family than the deep South. And as you can see, you'll see these huge parallels between slavery in different parts of the country. And as we'll explore, slavery in the South was just brutal. And there was a captive black population of the Chesapeake area which began to grow through fertility. And this just pragmatically stopped the flow of slaves from West India and Africa and kind of halted the Atlantic slave trade. As Thomas Jefferson did try to stop the Atlantic slave trade in 1807 during his presidency, even though that wasn't that successful. But as more slaves started to become produced just through plain fertility as well, it changed the game and stopped the huge importation of slaves from Africa. So slavery in the South, as you mentioned before, was just brutal and most intense. There was plantations all over South Carolina, and they were just lonely hells with little resources, so a lot of people just died early. And they would have to keep on importing slaves from the West Indies and Africa because that's the only way they would sustain the slave population. So slavery in the South was just brutal and horrific. So slavery north of the Chesapeake. So the northern colonies had about 48,000 slaves, but they were about smaller farms and not on these large-scale plantations like in the Chesapeake and mostly in the South. A lot of them toiled in cities for artisans, and they helped work in shops and helped work in commerce. Some did work in agricultural areas like New York's Hudson River Valley and northern New Jersey, but most of them were just skilled workers that would help their master. A huge difference from the physical hands on the large plantations in the South. So Afro-American culture. So there were distinctive African-American culture began to flourish throughout the colonies, which had a mixture of African and colonial American parts of religion, speech, and traditions. On the Sea Islands of South Carolina's coast, the blacks used a language called Gula, which blended English with the African languages. And many African words have been integrated into American language like voodoo, gumbo, and songs. And these songs contributed to the development of jazz. So even slavery at that time, even though it was horrific and brutal and just ruthless, it did have some benefits. You can look at it as they did contribute a lot to the growth of American culture. So slave revolts. In 1712, there was a New York slave revolt that involved the execution of 21 black slaves. 1739, there was a South Carolina slave revolt along the Stono River, the Stono Rebellion, where slaves tried to march to Spanish Florida, but slaves were eventually stopped by the local militia. Presumably they were killed, but I'm not too sure about that. And there's no slave rebellion that ever matched the destruction and the impact of Bacon's Rebellion. And as you remember, Bacon's Rebellion was the rebellion and the event that stopped the importation of indentured servants. So overall, even though there were slave rebellions, slaves were a lot easier to control and maintain than in indentured servants. So the structure of colonial society. Most Americans were small farmers, owned modest holdings. The cities contained skilled artisans, shopkeepers, tradespeople, and unskilled laborers as well. So they were more diverse and had more of a balance. But the social ladder had more openness and had more freedom than that one in Britain, and hence this results in the American dream, as one can hope to rise from the bottom to the top, which was just impossible in Britain. There was some stratification, as there were armed conflicts of the 1690s and 1700s that allowed the merchant princes, who were just rich aristocrats in the New England and Middle colonies, to lay foundations with profits as military suppliers. And now, because of that newfound wealth and this newfound power, these elites started buying imported clothing and dining at their tables and try to try to distinguish themselves from the other members of society. And yes, these prominent individuals were better seated at churches and schools, and the richest 10% of the Bostonians and Philadelphians own about 2/3 of the wealth in the regions. So it's just shocking how, even though we have this American dream, we have the social freedom, we're getting to this income inequality right away within a couple hundred years with the first exploration of the Americas. So the results. So the descendants of the original settlers faced limited prospects as the soil dwindled and holdings divided with more kids. As the soil in the New England colonies were just bad. The soil from tobacco was just getting worse and worse. And because these people started populating, as more women started coming over to the New World, the land was getting more sparser and sparser. So in the South, the power of the great planters and ownership of their large amount of slaves caused them to hold a lot of power, while the poor whites were just tenant farmers. So in the South, these large-scale families would just own the entire colonies. As you can see, the families of Virginia, the first families of Virginia, would just own the majority of the plantations in Virginia and the majority of the slaves because they had the most power and money. And jailbirds, nothing to know for the test, were convicts shipped to America after violating England's strict penal code. So these jailbirds couldn't even have been real criminals. They could have been just people who were in debt or who practiced another religion instead of the Catholicism or Protestantism, which was the state religion at the time period. So a lot of these jailbirds weren't actually real criminals. So slaves were presumably at the bottom. They had no chance to ascend to a higher place in society because they weren't real people, at least according to the law, which is just a horrific concept, but that's what the law said. They weren't real people. The British authorities vetoed all efforts to stop the transatlantic slave trade, but these North American colonists condemned the immorality of the slave trade, but they still profited off it. As you can see, that parallel with a lot of issues today, as we realize that it's just immoral and just horrible, but we benefit economically off it. Just like sweatshops, we realize how badly these women and children are treated in these Southeast Asian countries, but yet we still profit off it, so the US government will just turn a blind eye. And this creates a conflict of interest between the economic and moral issues of slavery, which is the argument in the United States for the next 150 years. So yay. So the professions. So the clergy in about 1775 had less influence in the early days of Massachusetts in the Puritan colonies, but they still occupied high prestige and power. The physicians were poorly trained and not highly esteemed, but young doctors served as apprentices and had the chance to face victims because they were poorly trained, and the people who got treated were mostly had a high chance of being injured, infected, or even killed. Epidemics were constant nightmares with smallpox, diphtheria, and other diseases killed thousands, as these colonists had no vaccines, and they were still relatively new to some of the diseases that they encountered. And even lawyers weren't well regarded at the time period, and they were seen as troublemaking rouges. So as you can see, it's a huge difference from our society today, where doctors and lawyers are considered the higher members of society. In this time period, unless you were a member of the clergy or you were a plantation owner, you weren't considered the uppermost ranking member of society. So other jobs. So agriculture was obviously the leading industry, with 90% of the people being farmers. Tobacco was the main crop in Maryland and Virginia, but as you mentioned before, tobacco ruined the soil. So over years, the people in the Chesapeake Bay area couldn't plant tobacco anymore because it would just ruin the soil. The middle bread colonies, they produced large amounts of grain for the entire colonies, so they had solid industries. And fishing was rewarding in New England, which was shipped to a lot of Catholic countries in Europe, like the German states. So as you can see, a lot of these colonies have huge diversities, as there's fishing and shipping in the New England colonies, grain and farming in the middle colonies, and then in the southern colonies, you have all of these cheap crops that would be headed by large-scale plantations. So the commerce in the colonies. There's a lot of commerce on the coast and overseas with the colonies, like in New England, New York, and New Jersey. But land speculation was as popular as a get-rich-quick scheme, as people wanted to buy as much land and just sell it off as a way to make money in the colonies. And also, Yankee seamen were successful in lugging cargo from America to other parts of the world. So even with some of Britain's strict trading laws on the colonies, the Yankee seamen and the New England shippers made a lot of money shipping their crops to other parts of the world. So the triangular trade. So this was the horrific trade with slavery, obviously, but it was a trade that was profitable between New England ports, the Gold Coast of Africa, and the West Indies. So basically, seamen would bring rum to the Gold Coast, who would barter the liquor for the slaves. Then the slaves would be brought to the West Indies, where they'd be exchanged for molasses, and then that molasses would be used to distill rum in the New England colonies, and then that new rum would go back to the Gold Coast, and you see this trifecta of just horror. As you can see, the worst part of it is that we're trading people as if they're property and as if they're crops. It's just horrific, and we have to explore and understand it, but we also have to understand how bad it was. So as you can see, you see the arrow from the New England colonies to the Gold Coast of Western Africa, and then you see after that the Western Africa bringing the slaves to the West Indies, and then the West Indies bringing the molasses to the New England colonies. So you see rum to Ghana, molasses, slaves to West Indies, and then rum to New England. So you see this triangular trade of just horror. So the manufacturing in the colonies. So the workers get rum, beaver hats, and other manufactured products in the colonies for cheaper prices than from Britain. So they started developing the sense of independence as they could survive economically and have lower products at cheaper prices. The lumbering was a huge part of the manufacturing, as timber was consumed by shipbuilders and then shipped to other places in the colonies, which boosted the New England industries. The colonial naval stores like tar, pitch, rosin, and turpentine were valued for increased shipbuilding for the British Navy, as the British Navy was the largest and the most powerful in the world after the defeat of the Spanish Armada. So they wanted to keep that high status, so they relied on the colonies to provide a lot of supplies for their navy. So there were disagreements. The Americans wanted access to the other markets, which is understandable, than British goods, because the British government and Parliament strangled the colonial trade with the writs of assistance and all these other trade restrictions, who made them only trade with the British Crown legally. The trade with the West Indies for timber and foodstuffs was taxed by the British government, so it angered colonists who wanted to trade with the French West Indies, but the British government forced them to only trade with the British West Indies. And the Molasses Act, as you can see, is a huge turn. It was the first act passed by Parliament to stop trade between the French West Indies and the colonies, and as you can see, it obviously caused merchants to smuggle and bribe around the law. And even at this time period, even though there's a lot of smuggling and illegal trade, there's still this idea of salutary neglect, as long as the colonies provide enough resources and materials to Britain, Britain wouldn't care too much about their smuggling. So transportation. In the 1700s, the roads connected major cities and were poorly organized. The waterways were used for transportation, but the populations were clustered around the banks of navigable rivers. Taverns popped around main routes of travel, representing a sign of American culture, as these bars, with alcohol, were also transfers of information. And the intercolonial postal system was established in the mid-1700s, and it was largely ineffective, but it was the first, it was an example of the colonies working together for better forms of transportation. Intercolonial assistance and intercolonial unity is a huge theme that we're going to explore in later chapters. So the problems with the church, surprise. So we established churches with the Anglicans and the Congregationalists, though large parts of the population didn't worship any church. The Church of England, whose members were called the Anglicans, became the official faith in Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and New York. And they fell apart because they clung to a faith that was less fierce and more worldly than the religion of the Puritan New World, as the Church of England. And the Church of England relied on the political support of the king and the parliament back in England, but because it didn't have that in the colonies, it just fell apart and cracked because of weak leadership. So the Congregational Church, which grew out of the Puritan Church, was established in all the New England colonies except Rhode Island, which had freedom of religion. Presbyterianism was never made official in any of the colonies, but it was also a major denomination of Christianity in the area. The ministers traveled from Europe, had problems with the other forms of Protestantism, and disapproved of the New World faiths because they were more liberal and they had more tolerance and freedoms than the denominations back in Europe. The Anglicans had no resident bishop, as I mentioned before, so they had no strong leadership in the colonies. And yes, there was religious toleration, as the ministers thought there was too much, but there was religious toleration. But the Americas still had some discrimination against Catholics, and definitely discrimination against other sects and other religions. So the Great Awakening. So religion was less important in the 18th century, and the Puritan churches had to balance between doctrine and beliefs and liberalizing membership requirements, as they couldn't just only take the elect or the chosen people into their congregational church, or else they would have no one left who really believed and into their denomination. The liberal ideas began to challenge old-time religion, and worshippers even believed that predestination wasn't a dogmatic truth. As remember, for predestination with John Calvin, everybody hopped onto predestination and thought it was the word and the mandate of God, but these new ideas coming in this time period tried to prove that otherwise. Arminianism was a belief that individual free will, not a person's fate, would save them by God's grace, became an obvious threat to Calvinism because it just completely just denounced it and was another alternative for people to believe in. And the churches resultantly had to concede that the spiritual conversion was not necessary for membership, or else they would just lose a lot of members and they would lose their power and influence within the colonies. So more about the Great Awakening. It was a movement in the 1730s and 1740s which called for more religious revival. Jonathan Edwards is a main figure in this, who was a preacher that believed that there was a mistake in believing in salvation with good deeds and good works, rather than depending on God's grace, was healthy for salvation, because he believed in predestination and was definitely a more conservative thinker at this time period. George Whitefield, another important figure at this time period, he had a different style of evangelical order. He revolutionized the spiritual life of the colonies by calling a message for human helplessness and divine omnipotence. And he also called sinners to plead confession and to be saved, quote unquote, from religious damnation, as he thought that anyone who didn't believe in predestination and this conservative Protestantism was damned for their entire life. So there was the old and the new lights. The old lights believed in this emotional and theatrical antics of the revivalists, like the Edwards and the Whitfields, but the new lights believed in defending the awakening for their role in revitalizing American religion. So the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians were split on the issue, and the awakening left many lasting effects, including the emphasis on direct emotive spirituality in the religious denominations, the increased number and competitiveness of American churches, and it encouraged a fresh new wave of missionary work among the Indians and the slaves. So it was the first spontaneous movement of the American people to break the sexual boundaries and to be united. And as you can see, another example of colonial unity that is going to be a recurring theme as we just start moving through history. So to schools and colleges, education was primarily thought to be only for males and for leadership, not for citizenship, which were fallacies that were later corrected as time went on. The period in New England was dominated by the church and stressed the need for Bible reading and the goal to make good Christians and good pastors rather than good citizens, presumably, which makes sense since the Puritan New England was very religious dominated through the government as well, and they had a strict discipline enforced by teachers and instructors. So the education in New England. So the area had an impressive number of graduates from the colonies, from the colleges in England, including Cambridge and including Trinity College in Oxford. They had a primary and secondary school system which was established in New England with a varied quality of instruction and school times. So a bit different than what we have right now in present day New Jersey. The education in the middle and the south colonies. So some of these schools were tax supported, like the schools are tax supported now, and some of them did have strong elementary school systems. The south had educational institutions diffused over large areas because there was large plantations that would just suck up large areas of the plantation with large numbers of slaves. And the wealthy families and the people who were destined for power and leadership mostly just used private tutors, like John Calhoun and other leaders that would come from the south. So college was geared toward prepping men for the ministry mostly. Well-to-do families sent children abroad for a broader education. That pun. They mostly went to colleges in Europe, mostly Cambridge and Oxford, for a better education. There was about 9 local colleges which were established during the colonial era, and the student enrollments were small because it was very expensive and people needed their men at the farm. And the colleges included Harvard, and you see King's College, Queens College. King's College was Columbia, I believe, and Queens College was Rutgers. I'm pretty sure. And the curriculum was heavy loaded with theology in dead languages at that time period. Dead, as in Latin and stuff. Even though some people spoke at the time period, it was not a wide spoken language. So it was a lot of archaic curriculum that wasn't very useful and very applicable at that time period. So more culture. So here we go to art and literature and stuff that isn't too interesting, but we have to cover it for the sake of just acknowledging it. So John Trumbull was a painter who was forced to travel to London to pursue the ambitions of his artistic desires because there wasn't that much opportunities in the colonies at the time period. Charles Peale was known for his portraits of Washington, and he was also a dentist, and he stuffed birds. Oh my God. Benjamin West and John Copley became famous painters who went to England to complete training, as there wasn't that much art schools in the colonies at this time period. And architecture was imported from the Old World and modified to meet climate and religious conditions of the New World, as the New World had a full year round with all 4 seasons, and also was more liberal. And there was more religious tolerance. So all these things had to be taken into account when art was being transported to the New World. So colonial literature. So Phillis Wheatley was an enslaved poet who published books of verse and other poems without any education. And one of my favorite presidents, Thomas Jefferson, called out Phillis Wheatley for saying she was a slave who didn't know much. But Phillis Wheatley was one of the greatest colonial poets of the time period, and I think she was the best colonial poet that graced the 13 colonies. As you can see, she had no sort of educational background at all, and she was still so impressive. Ben Franklin, he wrote Poor Richard's Almanac, a book known for its sayings regarding thrift, industry, morality, and common sense. Just like an apple a day keeps the doctor away, Ben Franklin came up with that. So science. Science at this time period was finally going away from superstition and theology. I mean, not total theology, but at least some sort of more reasoning. And Ben Franklin was the only first-rank scientist in the Americas, as you know, with his famous kite flying episode, which provided proof that lightning was a form of electricity. And he also invented the bifocal spectacle as a precursor to glasses that we use today. So the pioneer presses. So most Americans were too poor to buy books, and they were also too busy on the farm to read them. So hand-operated printing presses cranked about pamphlets, levels, and journals. About 40 institutions started to come around in the mid-1700s, which had pioneer presses to help put news into circulation as well as entertainment. So the Zenger trial. So now this is a huge event in the colonial time period. In the legal case in 1734 to 35, there was a case involving Peter Zenger, who was a printer who owned a newspaper that attacked the corrupt royal governor. This was occurring in New York, by the way. So he was defended by my main man, Andrew Hamilton, who argued that that he just printed the truth, but the Chief Justice had his mind set up that he was guilty for just printing it in the first place, which sets the argument how much freedom should the press have in printing. Is it slandering if it's considered the truth, or is it just, or are you allowing, or should you be allowed to say something as long as it's factually correct? However, even though the Chief Justice was out to get him, the jury still found him innocent, and this decision, this Zenger decision, was a huge achievement for the freedom of press and for the future of American democracy and the freedoms had in America. So back to politics. So 13 colonial governments had variety of forms, governments with a variety of forms, with 8 of the colonies having colonial governments, but the other colonies having proprietors and being run by joint stock companies. Every colony had a 2-house legislative body, with the upper house being appointed by the crown, the royal colonies, and a proprietor in the proprietary colonies. And the lower branch was chosen by voters and the people who hated the ruling colonial clique. And the legislatures were direct representation of the people, who voted for taxes or the necessary taxes on the colonies that they chose. So in this sort of colonial representation, the colonists did have they had taxation with representation, so they were happy, at least a little bit happy. And self-taxation was a privilege that the Americans had valued. So when the British started to tax them from Parliament, the Americans kept on calling taxation without representation, because they had no representation in Parliament to fight on their behalf. So more about politics. The governors were appointed by the king, and they were usually good leaders. The worst of the governors was Lord Cornbury, who was a governor of New Jersey and New York, was an embezzler, a religious bigot, and just a vain fool. Colonial assemblies had found ways to assert authority by withholding the governor's salary unless he complied with the request, which is basically blackmail. Like, sounds childish, but it worked. And the London government failed to understand that the governors were being blackmailed into complying with the colonists and with the rules and the regulations that they wanted. And because of that, tension started to come between the two, as they thought that the colonists were just disagreeing with them, but they were actually just blackmailing them. So it's the first rise of tension between the London government, Parliament, and the colonies and their legislatures. More about politics. The administration at the local level was varied with the town government in New England and the county government in the South, and there's a modification of the middle in the middle colonies. The ballot was on a birthright for the citizens, as privileged upper classes only let the white adult males who owned land and had property requirements and were mostly Protestant could vote on the ballot and vote for specific people. And many voters allowed leaders to rule and did not interfere unless they deemed necessary. So even before the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, America was functioning somewhat like a democracy, as people still voted for who they wanted, and they voted for the candidates that they thought were best to rule the land. So colonial life, it was heavy and constant, but they had a lot of food, but it was a monotonous diet. So you see some, pros and cons. The basic comforts that we have right now in the present day are lacking. The churches weren't heated. The fire was the only thing that kept people warm during the winters. There was no indoor plumbing. Candles and whale oil was used to light up places instead of light bulbs. And there was no heating during the winter. Amusement was allowed in the colonial life when time was permitted, with house raisings and weddings, but mostly it was about work on the farm. So more about colonial life. There was winter sports, but in the north, but the south had cards, horse racing, and cockfighting. Lotteries were actually approved as appropriate ways to raise money for churches and colleges. Holidays were celebrated everywhere, but Christmas was frowned upon in New England. I don't know why these strict Puritans had their own religious beliefs about certain things. And in the mid-18th century, Britain's colonies had differences overall, but they all spoke English. They were all mostly Protestant, and they all had some form of religious toleration. Even Massachusetts at this time had some form of religious toleration. They all had some form of self-government, as they were all appointing legislatures and voting their fellow colonists into power, and they all did have transportation and communication within other governments and within their own government as well. So they were self-functioning, and to an extent, even without Parliament's rule and Parliament's power over them. So this is the end of chapter 5. I know this was long. A presentation will be posted with this shortly, just so you can review the facts and take good notes and be ready for the test. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm signing off.